All right. So far, just give it a chance to see who else is joining and what stragglers might join. So yeah, we'll get started in a few. If you're wondering what a toque or a beanie, it's chilly in my loft today, and I got a bit of a cold. Okay, looks like a minute over 2. I'll give it another minute or so before we get things kicked off. Just about there, just about good to get started. I know a lot of times I show up at a couple minutes after the starting of the webinar, so I'll give those people some extra time. All right, cool. Let's get things kicked off. I'll leave a couple minutes at the end if anyone has any questions or wants to chat about anything in general with regards to the topic. But otherwise, if you no questions at the end, we can all get back to our work days and in our usual tasks that we got for the day. So yeah, let's get started. Welcome to round 2 of the LLM Showdown. So this started as a fun presentation topic for SMR North America back in November last year. So given that US was running state and local elections around that time and the conference was in Washington, I wanted to combine the two topics of politics and AI because, everything these days is about AI or politics from one person to another. So also caveat that I am Canadian, so this is technically run from a neutral perspective with regards to some of the political issues. So let's jump right in. Recap from round 1 that we covered in SMR North America, and just some of the highlights that we saw. So in the first round, the LLM Showdown, we put ChatGPT and Grok head to head. So data collection for a political poll, and it touched on some of the most important issues in politics today in the US back in November. So we'll touch on some of our findings and highlights from round 1. All right, politics and focus, Dems versus the GOP. So in round 1, we looked at a number of rating scale and ranking questions just to see how well each model understands political sentiment in the US. So we looked at the overall results from a top line level, just at how well distribution was just on each question. Deeper for segmentation for these predictions. So we came up with a scoreboard for the showdown, and we awarded points for each round. And I'll touch on that a bit further before we go around. But we gave each model. So in the first round, we asked them just to rank political issues. So what you see in this chart here is just the results of our ranking question that we had each model go up against each other. And you can see results blue is Grok and ChatGPT is green. So what we saw in the first round, we saw that Grok was, had a pretty strong ability to rank political issues, not just from a top line perspective, but it also was able to handle segmentation rankings as well. So when we looked at different, affiliation by political party, gender, age, Grok proved to be pretty strong in its ability to predict rankings. But when we looked at ChatGPT, we saw that it was actually much stronger in predicting rating scale questions. So this was both from a top line perspective and a segmentation perspective as well. And ChatGPT also proved to be more reliable from a directional standpoint. So when we looked at box scores, it was able to predict them at a much higher accuracy rate than Grok. So in general, with a lot of the questions we asked both models to predict across the board, we tended to see polarity in terms of the types of questions that each model was better at. Grok was better with some ranking style questions, both top line segmentation, and ChatGPT was just better at rating scales in general and understanding just directional differences. But we also asked them to predict the election results. So that was an interesting thing to do around the time of an election upcoming. So here's some of the election results that we got from a prediction perspective. So just to highlight again, orange is our actual poll results, blue is Grok, ChatGPT is green. So the big kind of takeaway when we had both models predict the results of an election was that they treated it as a two-party race. They both showed two-party bias and failed to account for the middle. So what you can see there is there's a good portion of folks who selected that they were independent or that they were not sure or not voting. So this in reality is what you would typically see in an election, is it's more going to be a two-party race as opposed to a lot more people showing up as independent or not voting, because if you're not voting, you're not technically seeing those results. But when it came to the actual results or predictions, ChatGPT had the Democrats ahead with 45% of the vote, which fell in line with what our data collection results were. And but when we looked at kind of like the overall error for predictions, ChatGPT was actually higher. So in terms of how the state election came to be, ChatGPT seemed to be a bit more accurate from that perspective, but had a higher overall error. While on the other hand, Grok has the Republicans ahead at 44%, but it actually had lower overall error in its predictions. So both models had the race within 2 percentage points, which is pretty much within the margin of error in a lot of these results. But as you can guess, ChatGPT tended to be a little bit more accurate with some of its predictions. So let's see what the for had in the showdown. So just to highlight again, top line ratings went to ChatGPT. Grok counterpunch with top line rankings. The two traded jabs between segmentation rating and segmentation ranking. But when it came to box analysis, ChatGPT had just a better overall accuracy and just consistency with understanding directions, and that was both segments and top line result. So as you can see from based on the results here in the table, our winner of round one was ChatGPT. So let's move on to round two. So in the orange corner, we have our challenger, which is Anthropic's Claude. So it's fighting under the Opus 4.5 model with a knowledge cutoff date of May 2025. Self-described as trusted, thoughtful. We have our defending champion, OpenAI's ChatGPT, fighting under the 5.2 model, August 2025, knowledge cutoff, self-described as broad, even-handed, data trained, and logic first. Well, let's see how that fares out in the actual works. In this version of it, we ran a real survey, very similar to the first one we did, census representatives, so balanced to match census numbers in the U.S., 5-minute survey just on some of the most hot political topics at the time we fielded the study. And we also followed some of the best practices on user experience, if you've ever seen any of my other webinars on that. But then what we did is we had the AI predict results. So we gave each model identical prompts. We included in the prompt not to use external data or web searches, and we also gave it a sample composition of the breakdown of demographics. So we told it how many males, females there were, what the age bands were as well. Like the elections, we omitted that data, and we ran that first before it had any kind of that memory stored in there to impact its prediction results. So then what we did was we compared the results against our real data metrics. And we put together a scoreboard. So we used a point scoring system looking at mean absolute error, ranking accuracy, segmentational MAE, and just directional trends. In this version of it, 5 rounds is actually going to be 5.5 rounds because our box how well do these models predict the distribution across the questions in general? So can they predict the results for each rating question, and then can they predict the results for each ranking question? So top line is just looking at the distribution from a top line level. Graphics and groups. How well can each one predict for ratings? How well can they predict for rankings? And then we took box analysis. And like I mentioned, we did 2 separate box scores, kind of one for top line results and then one for segmentation results within the subgroups. So 5 rounds, or I'll say 5.5 rounds, 1 winner per round. All right, into round 1. So this is where we have top line accuracy. So this looks just at the overall distribution of each model across rating scale questions, looking specifically at mean absolute error. So smaller MAE equals more accurate predictions. So we scored this round on a question per question basis. So each model is awarded 1 point for winning for each question. Claude consistently, but it wasn't a blowout in this particular round. So Claude was able to take how often or how much people use AI understanding political policies, candidates, just anything politics related. So you would think that these AI models would have predicted that question the best, but apparently not. And I'll say with Claude that most people these days aren't using Claude as the traditional chatbot LLM like most people use ChatGPT. They're tending to build products using Claude code. So I'll give Claude a pass there. So round 1 goes to Claude. Let's go into round 2. So round 2 is our top line ranking. So this is where we're just looking at some of the top issues in the US today and how well each model can rank those. So both models were somewhat accurate in terms of its predictions. If you look at ChatGPT in comparison to the poll results, you'll see that it nailed it. Spot on. It got all 7 issues in the correct order and was very close in terms of percentage distribution. Claude was not that far behind in terms of its ability to rank and distribution, but it did obviously put a few issues higher and out of place in terms of the ranking order there. So, which is funny because when we looked back at the previous round 1 with Grok and ChatGPT, this is where ChatGPT actually fell a bit short and Grok was a bit more accurate. While in this round, ChatGPT is proving to be better handling ranking questions than Claude. So they do both seem to understand that the economy and inflation is the top issue in the US today. But where they kind of fall short is just the ability to understand, some of the economic anxiety that average Americans faced with the cost of living today. So they do understand some sentiment, but they don't necessarily understand how difficult it is to pay for things today. So that's where some of the cultural nuance between humans and AI has a bit of a gap and a bit of place to be made up. So yeah, we're back at 1-1 in terms of scoring for round 1, round 2. So let's jump into round 3. Right here, we're just looking at, again, following back to mean absolute error. And this, we're looking at segments across all rating questions. So when we cut the data by gender, age, or political affiliation, we can see Claude's consistently outperforming ChatGPT with the exception of older audiences. So again, smaller bar chart here. The more accurate was their prediction. But what we saw with regards to cutting the demographic or cutting the data into segments or subgroups was that both models actually struggled with some of their partisan predictions. There was much higher level of variance between political party affiliation with their predictions than there was with gender or age. I think it was 2x the error that we saw with political party versus gender. So they both, were able to capture some of the nuance of these subgroups. Like ChatGPT was actually better with older demographics, 55 and up. Claude was better 54 and under. But in general, across the board, when looking at all different subgroups, Claude was a bit more accurate in terms of predicting the results of our study. Moving on to round 4, same chart you saw earlier. This one, I flipped the colors given that we gave Claude orange, gave it the Quest orange. So this time we went with our Quest blue as our trend line. So the blue line is going to be our poll results. Green is ChatGPT, orange is Claude. So what you can see here is really, it does have some understanding of directional trends with regards to rankings and priorities. Both models seem to have a pretty strong understanding of Republicans, it looks. The trend lines there are pretty close, not a ton of variance between each data point. But on the Democrats, on the other hand, there tended to be a little higher level of variance there. So this is where we saw a lot more variability with political party affiliation as opposed to gender and age gaps or gender and age quotas. So that's why we wanted to highlight this one here. But in general, ChatGPT did better on ranking the segments, given that it did better on just the ranking questions in general. So what we saw from top line results carried over into segmentation as well. So finally, that gives us into round 5, which is our box scores. So this round, we're just looking at top line box scores and segmentation box scores. So from a top line view, the models were generally right from a directional standpoint, staying kind of within 10% of the box scores. But there were a few questions in particular that tripped up both models. One of which was actually ICE enforcement. So both models predicted higher levels of support for ICE enforcement while under predicting opposition, which is a little bit surprising from my standpoint. But the models thought that there was more support than there really was, at least with our results. The other question, again, that tripped them up was AI usage in politics amongst consumers. So again, it's a bit ironic. You'd think that these models would predict those right, but they didn't. But you can see ChatGPT is kind of generally better just from its box predictions across the board. So this is from top line results you can see in these charts. But when we started to cut the data by segments again, that script flipped. Claude was more accurate at predicting box scores for each subgroup, but in aggregate failed to top ChatGPT. And one example of this was in Q7 that we looked specifically at, and this was just asking about like government trust. ChatGPT completely missed the mark with Republicans on that. It had predicted 14% trust amongst Republicans in the government, while our poll results captured 53% trust. So what we notice is, when the Republicans are in power, you're going to tend to have more trust in the government from a Republican perspective. ChatGPT failed to capture that. Claude was close, not nearly as bad as ChatGPT was, but that's where some of these nuances, we start to understand their lack of ability to predict some of these things when you start to cut into specific subgroups and look at the nuances that are different between different demographic segments. So moving on to the final scoreboard, let's see what we got here for scoring. So if you're keeping track, in round 1, we had Claude take the early lead. Another counterpunch by ChatGPT. In round 3, we saw segmentation ratings getting taken by Claude. Another counterpunch by ChatGPT for segmentation ranking. And then box analysis, it was technically a tie. So as I'd mentioned earlier, ChatGPT was better with top line results. Claude was better with segmentation. So in theory, based on the scoring system that I used last time, this is technically a tie between the two. But given that no one likes a tie, we're going to take it to the judges' scoreboard, scorecard, I should say. And after careful analysis and our pointing system, we've got to go with our winner and new champion, and that's going to be Claude. Okay, so just to touch on some of the other results that we captured in our poll, just to highlight some of the differences between what we saw in our data collection versus what the models predicted. So we saw economy and inflation again was the highest priority for Americans. This was the case in our first poll we ran, and also the case in our second one. So Americans definitely feel the pinch from the cost of living perspective, and both models understood that it was the highest priority, but not at the level in which we saw. Um, so they again, they don't tend to feel it with their pocketbooks as much as the average person does. Um, but when we look at the next data point that we captured information on, and that was just looking at ICE enforcement. So as anyone would probably guess without running a poll, concern about ICE enforcement is polarized by party. So Democrats are definitely opposed to some of the ICE activities today, whereas Republicans tend to lean more in favor of them. And that was also the case with some of the sentiment on international issues. So we asked about Venezuela and the capturing of Nicolas Maduro. We asked about the annexation of Greenland. And what we saw there is sentiment's also party driven. So it's going to be, if you tend to fall on the side of the Democrats, you're going to push back on a lot of the stuff Trump's doing today in office. If you're Republican, you're tending to be in favor of it. Now, that wasn't always the case with every question, but that was trend-wise directionally where it went. So most of the issues in the news today tend to be political party driven, and that was certainly the case in our poll results. But to finish off some of this with some form of agreement, Americans can agree on one thing, is that freedom of speech needs to be protected. So if you followed on some laws internationally, there's been stuff going on in terms of freedom of speech, stuff posted online. But whether people agree or disagree on ICE international issues, there's one thing they do agree on, and that's keeping and protecting freedom of speech. So let's look at how the election prediction results were for this round of our election predictions. And so what we had is, again, both models were fairly close to what our actual poll results were. And they both actually had the Democrats ahead this time by a healthy margin. Claude was actually within 2 percentage points of our prediction of our results with both Republicans and Democrats. ChatGPT was heavy towards, again, this two-party bias more so than Claude was. They treated it as a Democrats versus Republican race. They didn't factor in independents or not sure not voting as much. So that's where you saw a higher level of variance there between ChatGPT and Claude. So let's wrap some of this up with some lessons and takeaways. So after running round 2 of this LLM showdown, I think we can safely say that they can approximate public sentiment surprisingly well, and that it will only get better in time as more people use LLMs, as they get smarter. ChatGPT tends to understand the priorities and direction better than Claude, but Claude understands cultural nuance when it comes to predicting sentiment across subgroups. That's not to say these weren't without error. They certainly misread emotions for certain questions and at certain important issues. But AI is a part of everyday life for us, both professionally and personally, and it's going to start to have a direct impact on voters and elections in the future. 1 in 2 people today are currently using AI to understand politics or policies or candidates. So we also need to start to think, what happens when models start to show bias towards one particular issue or one particular party. So these are all important things to understand as we go forward, and kind of double down the importance of primary data collection, but all things we need to be aware of when it comes to getting information from credible sources. So as we start to wind down here, with a sign off. And, as a data collection company, I think it's important for me to reiterate that AI does not replace primary data collection. It's a tool that we should use as researchers to collect stronger and richer insights, but it should never replace the primary data collection that we run. Um, AI can always guess, but only humans can know. So with that, we're wrapping up the LLM Showdown. If anyone has any questions, feel free to fire them off in the chat. If not, I hope some of it was interesting to see how well these models predicted results, and give you some faith in primary data collection as it still stands today. Thank you.